Sounds good.
In all of the hysteria, all of the insanity regarding the Trump indictment, we forgot to notice that Fitch downgraded us. Fitch downgraded the United States of America, downgraded our credit rating. What exactly does it mean? How exactly does it affect us? And what happened to the idea that Bidenomics was working just great? Guys, welcome to the show. Presented by Americans for Prosperity, AmericansForProsperity.org, economic liberty, free speech. That's where it's at. The guy with me is Dr. Matt Will, economist at the University of Indianapolis. And you've been following these things as you do with the classes that you teach. And of course, the conversations we have right here. And we go from AAA to AA plus. And you're like, well, that doesn't seem like the end of the world. But it's a very, very big story, not getting enough coverage at all.
Tony, and in fact, I think it's a huge story in the financial markets because the rating of a country tells you how much it's going to pay in interest. You know, if you're a bad credit risk, Tony, and you go to get a loan, you're going to pay a higher interest rate on your loan. We are now a worse credit risk, and we are going to pay higher interest, which is already outrageous, which we can talk about because of this downgrade, Tony. And the thing is, the U.S. federal government is supposed to be the safest, most risk-free, we call it risk-free investment in the world. And we just got downgraded, and the world said, you are no longer as safe as you were yesterday. That is disastrous for the financial markets and for our country. And we got to get into, Tony, what this means for the deficit and how we got here.
Well, let's start with what it does to markets. We saw the markets open up down today. What does it do to them?
Well, what it means, Tony, is every interest rate in the world is based on first risk-free and then on top of that. So if you were to invest in, Matt Will Incorporated, well, you would get the risk-free return, which is the federal government return, plus a risk premium. Well, the floor just went up, Tony. The bottom, the base for all these calculations just went up. When rates go up, values go down. And this isn't even attached to inflation or the Fed. This is a rate increase not attached to all those other rate increases.
So we talk about rate increases that we've seen in terms of interest rates, Dr. Will, talking to Dr. Matt Will, economist at the University of Indianapolis. And we don't see that going down. And even when people talk about inflation cooling, and look, the job market has contracted a little bit. And that's exactly what people like Jerome Powell, chairman of the Federal Reserve, and others have been looking for. Try and bring that down into some square. That will help level off inflation, and that'll get things lower, and that'll get this economy in a much better shape. They cheer that. They talk about how good and valuable that is. Now bring this into play, this downgrade. What does it mean for that job market and for those businesses?
Well, Tony, when rates go up and values go down, businesses will do less. They will build fewer factories. They will produce fewer goods. They will hire fewer employees. So the entire bar, if you're an investor, Tony, you've got to make a certain return. Well, the bar you have to get over is now higher. It's tougher for you to get over that bar. So you're not going to make an investment if you can't make a profit. I know that sounds weird, but you're not going to invest if you can't make a profit. And now it's harder to make a profit.
So here's how people at CNBC put it. Fitch downgrades U.S. long-term rating to AA plus, AA plus from AAA. And when they engage the key points, Fitch said the repeated debt limit political standoffs and last-minute resolutions have eroded confidence in fiscal management. If I were to listen to that, Dr. Matt Will, I'm being told by Fitch that the problem here is that Republicans tried to work a deal with the Democrats as opposed to just signing everything that the Democrats wanted and let the spending go on willy-nilly. Fitch is clearly applying blame here, and the blame is not going towards Bidenomics. Is Bidenomics to blame for this downgrade?
Well, Tony, yes, they are to blame, but I don't think they're blaming the Republicans. You have to read their full report. The core of their report, the core of their argument is that the deficit this year will go from 3.7% of the GDP to 6.3%. Tony, think of your household income. That means you're living on 3% borrowed money last year, and this year you're living on 6% borrowed money. Now, that's what the core of their argument is. You got to get into the second and third paragraph of their analysis. That's their real concern. And that's going to get worse, Tony, because we're now at 120% GDP. So the total credit card bill for the country is 120% of what we make in a year. And that's getting worse. Let me tell you, Tony, there's a bigger story here, and that is increasing interest rates, which means the amount of money that the federal government pays in interest is going up so much that this deficit will consume all the money we make. That's what they're concerned about. 3% to 6%, maybe.
No.
10%.
You brought it up. I'm jumping right in. I'm going to knock you one right out there. You're saying that interest rates can go up again. Of course, Jerome Powell, chairman of the Fed, has left that possibility open. They just went up a quarter point last month. That target rate is 5 to 5.25. I'm sorry, 5.25 to 5.5% right now from the Federal Reserve. You're not saying if rates go up, you're saying when rates go up. What if this downgrade has you saying that?
Because, Tony, the federal government is currently paying interest on loans that they borrowed money on at low rates. You have a mortgage, Tony. The mortgage you took out 10 years ago, you're paying 3% on. When you have to refinance that mortgage, Tony, you're now going to pay 6 or 7% on that mortgage. That's what I mean. It will go up. The amount of interest the government pays will go up because the loans, all that money we've borrowed, has to be refinanced at double the rates, Tony. When it was borrowed under Trump and under the previous people, they were paying 2-3%. Tony, now you're going to be paying 5 or 6% when the government refinances their loans.
So walk me through that process. What do you mean by the government refinancing their loans as opposed to me refinancing my loan? How does that work?
Well, we know that the government has, I forget the number, maybe $30 trillion of debt. And they borrow that money. Let's just take $100. So they borrow $100 at 3%. They never pay off these loans, Tony. When that loan matures, they get a new loan. Well, the new loan for that same $100 isn't going to cost them 3%. It's now going to cost them 6%. So, Tony, the government is doubling their borrowing costs. That means when they put their annual budget together, they've got to double the amount of money they put into interest. That doesn't leave any money for defense or social programs because they're doubling the amount of money they're having to spend every year just on interest on their long-term loans. This is the government. People have to understand the government's borrowing insane amounts of money that they never pay back. So they're just perpetually financing this. Am I confusing, Tony? I don't think I'm making sense.
No, you're not confusing me. You're not. It's just bothersome. It's bothersome stuff because what we're told is that Bidenomics is going great. This economy is growing from the bottom up and the middle out. Middle out was a term from the show Silicon Valley on HBO, and I don't want to have to recreate some of the things they thought about middle out. But you keep hearing this. They're debating right now in the White House whether or not to go on a victory lap because inflation was 3% for 1 month and because the labor market has had this very slight contraction, which is the direction that they wanted to go in. They're debating whether or not to overly cheer this thing. Is it your belief that this move from Fitch is about to cause a big problem in the next month's report?
I don't know that it's going to cause a next big problem in next month's report, Tony. This is a longer term problem. Fitch is saying, now, Tony, we're going from AAA to AA plus. Okay, let's not overreact too much. But what they're saying is we're heading down the bankruptcy curve, just a little bit, but we're heading down the curve. Tony, we never head down the curve. The federal government is solid, but they're heading down the bankruptcy curve. We're going from 3.7% of our total GDP is in deficit to now 6.3%. Tony, we got to use the analogy. In your household, if you make $100,000 and this last year, you spent 3.5% of that with borrowed money, and next year you're going to borrow 6% of your income to spend, and the next year you're going to spend 10% of your income to live on. Tony, that is not sustainable. Greece went bankrupt doing that. Cyprus went bankrupt doing that. We are heading in that direction. That's what Fitch is saying.
If you start the conversation with, we can't worry too much, it's only AAA to AA plus, I can also state very clearly that we have a much more worthy GDP than Greece ever did at a far different level of social programs. Talking to Dr. Matt Will, economist at the University of Indianapolis, I think the question for many people here is, how does it get back to square with that AAA rating? And are we putting too much on this idea that the rating even matters? Is it going to change whether another country actually lends us money? I get that it might change the interest rate that we pay them. And of course, that has an effect. But does it change the fact that nations will lend to us? Because I have to believe the answer is, if I owe the bank $100, it's my problem. If I owe the bank $1 million, it's the bank's problem. I assume that applies to the debt overall when we talk about these other nations.
You know what, Tony? I don't think it's that big of a concern because countries will loan us money. They're not going to just bury the money. When we buy something from China, we give them dollars. They don't bury the dollars in their backyard. They send it back to the U.S. I wish they would bury it in their backyard. If they buried it in their backyard, we just cut down some more trees and print some more money. But they don't. Believe me, they're going to send it back. That's never been a concern. It's not a concern. They're going to loan us the money. I hate the fact that we have to borrow it. I don't want to borrow the money. This is so irresponsible, Tony. I can't even explain how enraged this makes me. You got to read the Fitch report. The Fitch report says the problem is government spending. They are very clear. You got to read the whole report. The headline may point the finger at the Republicans cutting a deal, but the details point the finger at spending.
But there's not going to be an end. You're not going to see Wall Street say, you're not going to see politicians in the main say, you're not going to see Americans say, stop it, you're hurting us. You're not going to have anybody say, all right, now we have been shown that the answer is less spending. Wall Street, if there was less spending, would react crazy negative. True or false?
In the short term, true. In the long term, false. In the long term, when the private economy grows and the government isn't in default, they will be happy. But no, they want their drug now. But we've talked about this, Tony, we've got to get the market off, we've got to get them into rehab. I think we have to have an intervention right now.
Yeah, it's not going to happen. That's not going to happen. Dr. Matt Will, economist at the University of Indianapolis. I appreciate you taking the time to be with us, being a part of the show. And I can't thank you guys enough for being a part of the show. And I can't thank Americans for Prosperity, Economic Liberty, Free Speech. That is where it is at. You want to check them out. Find them in a state near you, americansforprosperity.org. Appreciate them being the sponsor. There is more videos coming. Make sure you subscribe on Rumble, on YouTube, wherever it is we are. Yeah, I know it's YouTube, but until they throw me off, you might as well try and reach people there and then get them over to Rumble, where it's all going down. Guys, rumble.com/Tony Katz. Don't forget to subscribe. I'll catch you next time. Take care.